Okay, now I want to invite somebody into this conference who's been grappling with the huge fallout from the pandemic on a day-to-day basis, and crucially from a pan-global, not a national perspective. Gloria Guevara, President and CEO, WTTC. Hello, Gloria. COVID-19 has transformed our future, leaving us horribly uncertain about where the travel and tourism sector stands. To some, it feels like this industry is the last in the queue for government. Some people have been very worried about the lack of coordination when it comes to worldwide industry response to the crisis. So can you tell me, what has the WTTC been doing to provide this leadership?
Thank you for the invitation to ITIC and World Travel Mart. What a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Taleb. It's great to see you again.
Always good to see you, Gloria.
Likewise. I think what's important that Taleb mentioned is to have a coordinated approach. And from WTTC, we have been trying to have that coordination approach, at least with the private sector and our engagement with governments. So your question is very valid, as it has been a very unique situation, but also very complicated. We have engaged with more than 150 governments from around the world. And at the very beginning of the outbreak, we issue an open letter where we ask the governments for three things, basically, to help us to protect the workers, because we don't want this health problem to become an economic and later a social problem, as we have seen, unfortunately. Then second is to help the businesses, medium, small, or large, in terms of liquidity, because there's not going to be, or there has not been any income for months. And the third one, any fiscal benefits, because if you have the choice to pay your taxes or pay your workers, we want to make sure they use whatever money left to protect and pay the workers. So WTTC has been engaged in that, especially at the beginning of the crisis, and also sharing best practices. We have documented more than 150 initiatives. All of them are in our website. You can download the files. But very important here is, how do we make sure that the governments learn from each other, some great practices out there. That's what we have spent most of the time at the beginning. Now we're working more on the recovery.
Well, let's look at the protocols that you have recommended, because obviously the overwhelming concern of any traveller and employee will be safety and hygiene. You've issued these best practice measures for every step of the travel chain. Can you perhaps just briefly explain what they are, and how can we ensure that they'll be followed all around the world?
Yes, I have a couple of slides, if you don't mind, that I would like to share really quick. Please. Just to put it in context, because I think what you're saying is very important, and hopefully it's going to be clear for everyone. Why are we talking about protocols? Why this is so important, right? I don't know if my screen can be shared, the 4 slides can be projected, but basically, let's remember that travel and tourism is pretty big, right? We represent 10% of the global GDP. We employ 1 in 10 people in the world. That's 330 million people. For the last 10 years, travel and tourism has outpaced the growth of the economy. Last year, for instance, was 40% more. And when we estimated the first impact of COVID to travel and tourism, we estimated that we were going to be losing 50 million jobs. But unfortunately, that number has been growing, and the last number is 100 million. And that's $2.7 trillion impact, which is significant. Now, we believe that we need to learn from the mistakes from the past, and we need to also learn from the things that we did right in the past. And we, last year, through the World Travel Mart, we launched a report on crisis that it was very important, because we took that platform, which is wonderful, and I'm glad that Simon is also here, where we shared our findings of 90 different situations that had impacted travel and tourism in the last almost 20 years. One of those was 9/11, as we remember. 9/11, it took us years to recover. Why did it take us years to recover? The main reason was because every country worked in silo, without the private sector involved and without a good coordination. And they implemented protocols for safety and security that they were totally different, or very different. Even 18 years later, when you travel before COVID throughout the world, in airports, the screening are different. In some places, they ask you to remove shoes. In some places, don't. Those are protocols, right? And unfortunately, when the protocols are different and you're trying to rebuild the trust from the traveler to recover, is the opposite, because it creates more fear. I remember at the very beginning of 9/11, going to airports, I was questioning myself, what am I doing here? Why am I flying, right? So it took us a year. So that's why from the private sector, the global private sector and WTTC, we say we cannot afford to make the same mistake. We need to rebuild the confidence of the traveler, and the protocols have to be the same. So we started with hospitality. Our hotels, the members of WTTC, have offered their rooms to doctors and nurses around the world. They have maintained those hotels COVID-free. Well, let's use that knowledge and learnings for the protocols so that we can have exactly the same experience for the travelers moving forward. And that's what we announced, the protocols for hospitality. For airlines and airports, we work with IATA and ACI, and we work very well with ICAO, who announced last week the guidelines that we are asking the members to adopt and embrace. And then we work with shopping outdoors and MICE and the different industries that we represent. What's interesting is that later they came and say, okay, if I am a traveler, how do I know that someone has implemented those protocols, right? And that's what we issue on a stamp that is called Safe Travels, that now the destinations are adopting. We have more than 80 countries asking us for the stamp. So far, we have released some good ones. Saudi Arabia, for instance, as Talib mentioned, was one of the first, and their leadership has been key, and we appreciate that. We work very well with them. But we have some other countries also. Portugal, a great example. Turkey, we're working with Egypt and many others. So, and of course, some states in Mexico and in Spain, Barcelona and Sevilla, and several others. So we're working with them so that they can use the stamp to create that consistency, and we can rebuild the confidence from the travelers sooner. And the second point that I want to highlight, because Talib mentioned this, and I think it's not minor, let's learn what other crisis was worse than 9/11 in terms of the impact to travel and tourism. Was 2008 financial crisis. It was bigger, the impact to travel and tourism, than the 9/11 situation. However, we recovered pretty fast. In reality, it took 18 months average in the world to recover. Some countries more, some countries less. Why was that? Because we had a platform that was created called G20. And the countries were very well coordinated, and they worked very close with the private sector, with the financial sector. So we knew exactly what was going to happen and when, and they took the same measures that help us to recover faster. That's why the collaboration among countries is crucial, is key. The platform of the G20 is a great example that we're working as WTTC very closely with them to help us to move faster through this recovery.
The talk at the moment, Gloria, is all about, I know, health passports, microchips, certificates, badges, wristbands, stamps you mentioned, trust scans. Some of these are technical things that we have to bring in. How do we know, or how will you choose, or who chooses which ones are adopted and which aren't?
That's a very interesting point, and we need to be very careful in not creating more confusion. We see this in two phases: after the vaccine, before the vaccine. After the vaccine, we're going to have a new normal where we can talk about the things that we should consider for climate, digital agenda, and all of that. Before the vaccine, we cannot afford not to travel because there are millions of jobs that depend on that, and people want to travel. Now, the passport that you talk about, the health passport, the WHO does not support that. We don't support that. Why is that? Because there is not a vaccine. What is the benefit of the passport? Then they talk about immunity passport. Unfortunately, according to the medical experts, you cannot guarantee that someone had COVID, cannot get COVID again. There's one case in Taiwan that they're still analyzing. So we need to be very careful of not impacting the travel experience and creating, things on top of that that will complicate travelers. So a certificate for testing might be good because we need to include the component of testing, contact tracing in the experience. And something that is very valuable, we need to look at the countries that they're doing better than others, because that's the reality. Some countries have been able to contain the spread, and some countries are doing more testing. So we need to talk about how do we include the testing component in the travel experience so that you can reduce the risk, and on top of that, with the protocols, reduce the risk of spreading the virus. So before the vaccine is available, again, based in the lessons learned, because after Ebola, SARS, or MERS, there was not a vaccine, right? And we were able to travel. Why was that? Because we were able to isolate the sick people, and we were able to isolate the people infected. We need to work on that, and the only way is testing, contact tracing. And that's why we believe that that's what we need to do now. Some people are talking about including your testing in an app and having that with you. That's okay. You just need to be very careful of talking about passports for immunity, because there might be some discrimination aligned with that. And you don't want your medical history in your phone and be exposed to lose that information, of course, of hackers.
Thank you. Now, some people are kind of painting out a roadmap here, which they think is the safest. And I think a lot of people agree, which is that domestic tourism first, then regional tourism, then international in terms of priorities and ease, I suppose. But for you, is there a benefit to domestic tourism? Because obviously, economically, it's not foreign currency coming in, it's money staying within the country. What do you think about that?
WTTC, because as we measure the impact to GDP, right, we quantify both domestic and international. In the chart that I had, that you can display that later, you will see that 70-something% is the contribution from domestic, and it varies by country. Domestic can help us to recover, and that's a good opportunity to start rebuilding that trust from the traveler. And personally, I know that from my own experience when I helped my own country to recover from H1N1 and the financial crisis, but we had the perfect storm in Mexico. So domestic can help us to start the recovery process, and we believe that that is also happening in China and in Asia, and the countries that were hit them first. So we will see domestic, and then we will see regional, and then international. And regional is very important as well, because we need the support from the governments to work together. You need three components: the medical component, the tourism component, and the political will, so that we can build these bubbles or corridors or coronavirus resilience zones or green zones, whatever we call it, is very important to connect these zones, like kind of what Australia and New Zealand is doing, and some countries within Europe, so that we can see the movement of people and allow people to travel before we move to international. During this summer, it's going to be very interesting to see the recovery. We will see movement of people, domestic, and hopefully regional as well. For instance, within Europe and some countries in the Middle East and other countries in Asia, and of course in America.
This conference is about investment opportunities in tourism. Why should people invest in tourism now?
This is the right time to invest, actually, to tell you the truth, because two things. This is the most resilient sector, right? This is the sector that has been growing at the most when you look 10 years before. This is the sector that has recovered for every single crisis, every single situation. And I call this sector because we have multiple industries within the ecosystem. And right now is the best time to invest. Now is not the time to save money. Now is the time to invest. Why is that? Because it will recover. It's just a matter of time. So they need to make sure that they look at the opportunities. And what I can tell you from my members, because I talk to a lot of CEOs from around the world, they are investing. Now is the chance to invest. And we have seen some interesting opportunities to invest.
Okay, just lastly, and there's so many more questions I could ask you about, but we will hopefully cover some of these topics during the conference today. But we are talking, in terms of expense, or the amount of outlay, investment, in fact, in the country, in order to adhere to the kind of measures that you want, the protocols you want. A lot of investment, a lot of money. Some countries can't afford that. How can we ensure that this is a uniform process and that everybody, because we're talking from, but we're talking from the taxi driver to the hotel receptionist to the wherever, every step of the chain. How can we make sure that it's uniform?
Well, when you look at the amount of money that needs to be invested to use and implement the protocols, as you say, it depends. For some of them, it's not that significant because it's just a matter of social distancing and using sanitizer and wearing the mask, for instance. For some others, like hotels that they offer buffets, as an example, yes, they need to do an investment. because we cannot offer this buffets that we knew in the past for now. They need to have some plastics or cover that and have people serving that as an example as part of the protocol. So what I would say is that we're also working with development banks, we're working with countries, because part of supporting the sector, we made 4 points that are needed to recover. And not, unfortunately, every country is going to recover at the same time. Depending of the support that they are receiving from their government and depending of the collaboration, public and private, and depending of the initiatives that they're implementing, how are they going to be recovering? But if they implement the protocols, if they work in a coordinated approach with the governments and among countries, if they add the component of contact tracing, testing contact tracing to the health experience, and then the governments, they have to support the sector during the recovery, not only during the crisis. Because the reality, this is not a switch on and off, that suddenly we're going to have the planes full and the hotels full. They need to help us to implement the protocols. If they don't help the SMEs and they don't help the businesses, most likely those countries are going to take longer to recover. So this is a time for governments also to borrow money and to invest in travel and tourism. I think I would say that is not the time to pull back now. It's actually the opposite.
Well, the point you just make there, we're going to segue into right now, because we're going to talk about finance and investment. Gloria Guevara from the WTTC, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.